Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Sirius Report. It's Ken and Paul once again. And Paul, sixth gen fighters, electronic warfare software for free. China is rapidly taking over the global advancement of technology. Paul, as always, I want to thank you for being a part of this great discussion. And, we don't necessarily, want to harp on China, but man, things are going fast and furious while the West is just declining and decaying absolutely at a rapid pace.
Yeah, well, thanks for joining today, Ken. I think this is extremely important because China historically has never been viewed as being technologically advanced militarily. I think that's was true at one point in time, but again, for the last decade, that has not been the case. The West has been asleep at the wheel with regards to China's capabilities. Not least, it's one of the few nations on the planet that has hypersonic missiles, as we know, along with the Iranians and obviously the Russians and the North Koreans to some extent. But we wanted to discuss a raft of recent developments, news that's come out that probably goes under the radar because it's not in the West's interest to portray China as being militarily having prowess. I'm not talking specifically about the military personnel and that side of thing. I'm talking the more sort of high end weapons technology, new technology. I'm not saying China's military is incapable, absolutely not. But China's not fought a war militarily like that for a very long time. The world's changed. And I hope China never fights a war on that basis either. But first thing to start off is the so-called high power microwave weapons that use directed energy to hit targets. There's been a lot of discussion about that. We talked before about how Russia showcased those weapons in Syria in 2015, 2016. But what's interesting about this new development is that China's apparently overcome this quite major technical hurdle in the development of these directed energy weapons. Now, the so-called high power microwave weapons, HMPs, this is still apparently in laboratory testing and not ready for, quote, immediate deployment in the field, but it can generate electromagnetic pulses, which are comparable energetically to a nuclear explosion. So you get the idea of the gravity of what we're talking about. And of course, that can be highly disruptive and even destroy electronic components within, obviously, adversaries' weapon systems. Now, the US has said it's announced plans to deploy these weapons in the Indo-Pacific region, targeting Chinese satellites. But these weapons employ traditional sort of antennae and require constant rotation to engage different targets. Now, these new Chinese weapons are very different because they use this technology that precisely focuses the energy. It increases the range capability and the extent of the damage it can cause, and it can have simultaneous attacks on multiple targets. Now, at one time, people said these weapons, you could manufacture them, it was impossible because the argument is the pulse it generates could potentially destroy the weapon itself. But now this technology the Chinese have developed can reach or even exceed a total power of 1 gigawatt. And this generates via these rotating electromagnetic waves to be converted into this more stable and evenly distributed to a number of channels for this phased array antennas. So this is game changing. Yes, people say, well, it's not being available in a sort of industrial capacity, meaning in terms of utilizing it in warfare, but it's probably not that far away. And probably knowing how nations are, they're always one or two iterations ahead of information that comes out. So this is potentially another weapon that's going to cause the United States huge consternation because at this point, the United States doesn't have this technology. So this is another example, in this case of China, having technology that is well in excess of anything the West has. And if the United States seriously thinks about deploying such technology in the Indo-Pacific, then they've now got something that then will be focusing their mind as to what happens if China deploys that, because it makes our technology look very lightweight in comparison.
In many ways, that's been sort of the dream of both politicians and military, is to find that neutron bomb technology where you can either wipe out a population while protecting the infrastructure and the land, or to be able to cut off, especially since everything is based technologically today, to be able to shut down, whether it's ships coming in, whether it's aircraft, radar being, whether it's missiles launched at your country, to be able to eradicate that offensive threat, to do that without actually doing a lot of killing, without doing a lot of destruction to the land or to infrastructure. And something like this is exactly the types of technology that, are the game changers today. Because as we move away from battlefield of soldiers and artillery and tanks, et cetera, and more towards things like hypersonic missiles and to drones, et cetera, where there's fewer and fewer people on the battlefield, that's going to mean the targets are going to move from the said battlefield to rather more populated areas, to cities, et cetera. And you've got to be able to protect that. And something like a electronic either jamming system or a complete electronic EMP system to destroy whatever artillery or missiles or ships or aircraft that is coming at you, to be able to stop them in their tracks. That pretty much is like a deterrent that will, I don't want to say end warfare as we know it, but it will make nations, and especially the West, want to come to the diplomatic table much faster than to do any type of military threat.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's worth noting there's been kind of stories doing the rounds for probably a couple of years or so with regards to, because the United States has been quite provocative in the South China Sea, we know on occasions. But the stories come out on several occasions that the Chinese were able to use electronic warfare and they were able to cause mayhem to carrier strike groups in the South China Sea of the United States, where they could basically neutralize any jamming attempts by the United States themselves. And in the process, they were able to understand better the United States' electronic warfare systems themselves. Now this must have been sharpening and focusing minds inside the Pentagon and saying, we're dealing with a different beast here with China. China isn't what we once thought it was. They do have the capabilities to cause us huge amounts of problems. And that is just something also, to mention, because it all comes about that these developments, some of them are recent, but there's been this ongoing change of China militarily. And they've certainly showcased for the United States' benefit some of like the electronic warfare technology they have in places like the South China Sea. What I thought was worth mentioning, though, as well, was, and you mentioned it previously in another podcast, Gamber, just as a one-liner, was China's so-called sixth generation fighter, which ironically came out on December the 26th of last year. Talk about making mention of it when the West's busy with Christmas stroke holidays and not really paying attention. But that was the date when in the China's next sixth generation fighter jet successfully made its first flight. And the belief is this is going to reshape the next era of military aviation. Why? Because it has far more advanced stealth capabilities, which means you can't detect it very easily with enemy radar. It's got next generation avionics systems. It has integrated artificial intelligence. So the argument is it can, process enormous amounts of data, etc., in real time very quickly, and then can make decisions that ordinarily you couldn't make in anywhere near as quick as you can possibly do with this technology. And of course, the jet can also be integrated with all these drones or unmanned aerial vehicles. And this would allow enormous amounts of additional flexibility and in terms of combat operations, because the aircraft can work in tandem with drones. That can be not just in terms of reconnaissance, but also strike missiles and a defensive capability. And of course, what does the sixth generation fighter can do? It can carry hypersonic missiles, which of course, the West doesn't have a sixth generation fighter and it doesn't have hypersonic missiles. So this is going to cause huge consternation also for the United States, because of course it's going to be equipped with radar systems that can engage threats at far larger distances. I mean, and the jet could also incorporate potentially directed energy weapons. We're back to that discussion again. And this is going to have profound implications, not only for the Chinese Air Force, but in terms of the global balance or imbalance in military power. Because, yes, we're not dismissing Europe, the UK or NATO and Japan have been collaborating on a similar program, but they're not supposed to produce a next generation fighter jet for probably another decade, which means probably longer than a decade, because the West never produces anything on time or on budget particularly. And who knows, within a decade, what China might then have a seventh generation. But it's definitely moving militarily its capabilities, China, including cutting edge fighters, bombers, unmanned systems, in what's being termed this kind of triad. And the focus on all the technological superiority that China has and integrating artificial intelligence. If you can make real-time decisions infinitely faster from collecting data from multiple sources, including drones and satellite, and obviously it's reliable data, that changes the whole perspective of the battlefield. And this is not saying the United States is going to war with China or vice versa. But if China continues to develop technology that puts them at a notional huge advantage, it's going to sharpen minds in Washington and go, do you know what? We don't want to risk having any engagement with the Chinese, because this could turn out to be very embarrassing. But also they have to be thinking, well, if China's developing this technology, what does that mean for the likes of Taiwan if it ever comes to a situation there's military conflict with Taiwan? And I'm not saying it will happen, but these are the kind of thought processes that are going on in the United States and NATO countries. And, it's interesting that when they tested it, being the 26th of December, it happened in more than one location. They've also, around that time, been testing new amphibious assault drone carriers and also new airborne early warning and control systems. So all within the same day or the next day. So China's sending a signal out to the world, and not Russia, of course, but to the Western world. Look, we're developing technology that you don't possess. It's not just hypersonic missiles, it's next generation fighters, it's electronic warfare, it's these new microwave weapons that can be used to devastating effect. And whilst the West will try to sit there and pretend it's not a problem, these developments have come about largely in the last 5 to sort of 7 or 8 years. So you go back to the start of the Trump administration, they didn't have these weapons. And, well, not that we were to be utilized in combat or potential combat. So it's a very different world that Trump enters into for his second term as opposed to his first term in office.
Something else that we've talked about, Russia came out and demonstrated its Oreshnik IRBM just before the end of the year. Well, there's a few things that China has put out that we never talked about, but is definitely part of the advancement of their technology. Back in May, they showed off some rifle-toting robot dogs on the battlefield. A month ago, they revealed at a show the first unmanned robot tank. And then, of course, in December, it was reported that they rolled out military-proof 5G that can connect 10,000 Army robots all together on a single battlefield. So China is proving that they are preparing for conflict anywhere in the world, but they prefer not to do it. It's more of a deterrent than it is anything else. And unfortunately, the world is changing, and the U.S. is the mindset of we're the biggest arms seller in the world, and if selling arms is your big industry, then you need conflicts going on around the world. And if there aren't any conflicts to sell to, then they're going to try to create it. China's having to, and Russia, of course, are having to deal with this. We're seeing Iran in the West Asia, etc. But the more and more that these type of technological advances that will shock the U.S. because what they in Europe apply to older technology is easily destroyed in a short amount of time. What do they have to offer? Well, as the world sees more and more technological advances coming from China, and if they're willing to some of their technology like the software, and they're software free, then maybe it could be a game changer for the world's arms business as it becomes obsolete.
So another point that's worth making is China, which has caused a bit of confusion, and people are wondering why China's done this, is they've released this software that can be used to design electronic warfare weapons that was released for free by the Chinese. And initial assessments suggest it outperforms a US product, both in terms of speed and memory usage. Now, this is because China's been working on these kind of weapons for probably 2 decades at least. And the West and the wider world had no idea what they were doing. Now, the electronic warfare equipment used by the Chinese, of course, is evolving rapidly. There is this multi-band antenna used in this phased array radar, has these kind of complex structures. I'm not going to list them all, that current technology doesn't possess. The antenna also produces other complex phenomena during operation. And this, of course, simulating these types of electromagnetic characteristics computationally is challenging. Appears as though China's done this. And it appears as though the US alternative to this takes hours to perform radiation simulation and analysis on the same antenna. So again, this is indicative that China is light years ahead, as I've said, of Western technology. So the question is, why are they releasing it for free? Well, I think what this will tell you is that this software is probably redundant. It might be 1 or 2 generations old. It's not current. But what China's doing in releasing it is saying, well, here's some software, and this software outperforms the United States, as we said, with speed and memory usage. And it's an indication, principally for the West consumption, and particularly the US. Look, technologically, we're way in advance. We're not going to give you the current software, but we're going to give you a version that is still, ahead of anything you've got, just to make you aware of the fact that you are so far behind. In a way, it's quite humiliating, I would think, for the West, or particularly the United States, go, what? They've given us some software for free. I mean, in a sense, it's kind of like trolling the US and saying, well, look, technologically, we are very much in advance of you in all sorts of modern warfare, and obviously with regards to electronic warfare weapons. That is a clear indication. It's another example of what we said a bit earlier about China deploying technology in the South China Sea and causing mayhem for US carrier strike groups. So I think it's another point worth making. And I'll stop there, so obviously you can speak as well, Ken. Then I've got one final point, which I wanted to make about China and AI, and how the reaction in the United States has been highly interesting.
Yeah, the thing that stands out to me too is by giving the software for free, pretty much to anybody. They have access to it. It's an open database, but it also puts fear into the U.S. and Europe in that any nation could build both defensive and offensive weapons with this kind of technology to protect themselves from any Western interference. So that's what it's also doing, is it keeps the West, on its toes. Like, well, we want to go ahead and mess around in, say, Syria, or mess around in somewhere else. Well, now you're going to have to deal with the fact that if you want to send any type of military arms in there, you may just have them fall apart, before they even reach the border. But with that being said, China is also enforcing the fact that if Trump wants to re-engineer or rejigger the Monroe Doctrine and have control over the Western Hemisphere, Russia is the master of Eurasia. Well, China is, the South Pacific, I mean, the South China Sea and this part of the Pacific Rim is ours. And we're going to ensure that we have dominion over it. So, anyway, passing back to you, Paul.
Yeah, I thought as a final point, I wanted to talk about AI in China, because the United States, as people will probably be aware of, is putting export controls, excuse me, on chips for AI again. Oh, we're going to counter China, like we did with Huawei, which failed, like we did with semiconductor chips in a broader sense that failed. Now, it's very telling is as much the reaction that's come out from people within the US, such as the Semiconductor Industry Association, came out and said, look, we're very disappointed that a policy shift of this magnitude and impact is being rushed out the door just a matter of days before the transition to the Trump administration. And you didn't discuss it at all with us. You didn't ask us what our feeling is on this. Is this going to seriously impact us as an industry? And, basically these rules risk causing, again, all these unintended consequences and potentially damage to the US economy, its global competitiveness with respect to semiconductors and with respect to AI, because this could, give our competitors strategic market advantage, because they're seeing what these US policy decisions are doing and how damaging they are to the US itself, and it backfires on them. I mean, and certainly people within, excuse me, the semiconductor sector are calling it an unprecedented step that shows, look, the United States is trying to micromanage the government, that is Washington, the global chip supply chain, which is to the detriment of its allies and it's the US's own companies. This is not good for the Nvidias, etc. of this world. It can impact them in ways that's very detrimental. And interesting, apparently Nvidia themselves said While cloaked in the guise of an anti-Chinese measure, these rules would do nothing to enhance US security. These rules would control technology worldwide, including technology that is already widely available in the mainstream, you know, gaming PCs, etc. And the new Biden rules would only weaken America's global competitiveness and undermine the innovation that previously kept the United States ahead. And that's the nuts and bolts of it. When you start to implement policy decisions that damages the sector, damages your own companies, you have to realize the futility of doing this. Now, the question is, when the Trump administration gets in, are they going to reverse this? Probably not. But this, again, is the US not consulting with the industrial sector, be it semiconductors in this case, and saying, if we do this, is this going to materially damage us or our companies or our competitiveness or our standing on the world stage? Is it going to further accelerate China's development of its own chip technology? Because, there's that old saying, necessity is the mother of invention. And China has certainly gone, well, if you intend doing this, we're just going to have to pull our finger out and develop our technology at breakneck speed. And they've done this. And this is another example where governments have so out of touch with the reality of what's happening in the real world and making policy decisions that cause damage to your own sector and your own businesses is, of course, to put it diplomatically, idiotic.
Indeed, absolutely. Paul, as always, want to thank you for being a part of this great discussion and for your insight.
Yes, and likewise.
And to everybody here at the Sirius Report community, thank you for all of your support. Don't forget to like, subscribe, share, comment, send this out to anybody you think it might be important to. And until the next time we get together, have a great day.